It's wonderful to be here with you today, Morra. I've long admired your work and everything you've done. I've listened to your podcast, The Anxious Achiever, for a long time. We have mutual friends in common, and I've loved reading your book,
Thank you.
The Anxious Achiever. Turn your biggest fears into your leadership superpower. I love that framing and pivot. And it's a book that's relevant to so many people, whether they say it, know it, reveal it, and it's full of insightful stories, practical actions, and a lot of your own stories. So, hats off to you for having the courage to share that. It's uplifting too, on a topic that may not make you feel or think that it's actually uplifting. So, of course, today we're going to talk about anxiety, what it is, how it shows up, where it comes from, and what you can do, as I said, to turn it into a strength. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, David.
Fantastic. So let's set the scene a little bit, shall we? Anxiety. Now, there's been a lot of it in the last few years for obvious reasons. Pandemics, big social issues, climate change, geopolitics, and so forth. But if in your experience and your research, looking over a number of years and a number of countries, how prevalent is anxiety in the workplace, in business?
It's extremely prevalent. I mean, we don't have data for daily how prevalent it is, the way that we can say how many hours people spend on YouTube. But we know that anxiety is the world's most common mental illness. It's the world's most common mental health disorder. It is part of our natural human condition. And we also know that work is the number one contributor to people's mental health. And my favorite little statistic is that anxiety and stress are the number one reason why people miss work. So anxiety costs companies a lot of money, and it has incredible upstream and downstream effects on us and our teams every single day.
Wow, that's hit me hard straight away with all those. And perhaps I probably knew a little bit, but not all of that. But it makes me wonder, have I heard it being spoken about, apart from your own brilliant work, openly in terms of what you do about it? Not that much.
No.
So you talked about the downstream effects there. Just paint the picture again in terms of some of the biggest impacts on people of having, you talk about different levels of anxiety, but some form of anxiety.
Yeah. Anxiety exists on a spectrum, right? So what we know now is that neuroscientists and scientists are really reframing how we think about anxiety. When I say the word anxiety, you probably go, ugh. But the truth is, anxiety is sometimes really great, and we need it, right? If we didn't feel anxious, we wouldn't do anything. We would just sit on the sofa, right? And so anxiety is a wonderful motivator, and we need anxiety. The anxiety that you feel before you're about to do something that you care about. That's like good. It's good anxiety, and anxiety is not bad. It is, and it's an emotion. So at the top of the spectrum is sort of good anxiety. In the middle is what I think so many of us feel right now, which is this kind of weight that things are not really great. They're not okay. Something negative is around the corner. The bottom's about to fall out. The other shoe's about to drop, yada, yada. Yeah. And that may not prevent us from leaving our beds or functioning, but it's a weight, and it upsets our natural rhythm. And then, of course, at the bottom end of the spectrum is when anxiety becomes a disorder. It becomes a clinical mental health condition. And it takes many forms, and it is extremely common. I know in the US, they say that up to a third of people at any given time have a clinical diagnosed anxiety disorder. And that's only the people who've been to the doctor. Yes. So it's very common, and it can be really upsetting and limiting. I myself have had many times when I felt like I just couldn't leave my bed, when you just can't get from minute to minute. But the good news is there's treatment for that. So if that's you listening, please go get some help. So anxiety is multifaceted, and it hits us in different ways throughout our life. At work, anxiety shows up in a good way, in that we're like raring to go. I was up at 5 a.m. this morning. I'm just getting over COVID. So I was feeling really anxious about catching up, and am I going to feel okay? Am I going to feel like myself again? Am I going to be sick? And when I woke up feeling amazing this morning, all that anxiety actually manifested as like, I'm ready to go, and I have been going. Yeah. But anxiety can also affect us when we're worried. And when we're worried, we try to control things and we control other people and we micromanage and we do too much and we don't delegate or we yell or we're irritable. So it has a lot of negative effects as well.
Those negative effects there. I'm thinking if you're a manager, team manager or leader, obviously with care and responsibility for the people around you, those effects are pretty obvious and you probably wonder what's going on and you'd have to then carefully either ask, call it out. But many people mask it. So what are your tips and suggestions for somebody in some form of responsibility where you have an inkling of anxiety, whether it's an individual or the team around you? What do you look for?
I mean, one of the things that I'm really big on is tuning in. It's not just me, it's every psychologist in the world, because, a lot of us, we operate in the world in a way that is very, very head focused. And it's very much about operating 5 minutes from now or 10 years from now. We operate in the future. And that's actually a sign of anxiety. And a lot of us, especially us anxious achievers, we get used to operating in the future and always thinking ahead and always worrying and always trying to go for that next pole of achievement. And that does allow us to mask our anxiety, right? We feel like anxiety is our oxygen. It keeps us pushing forward, but we're actually probably also storing a lot of that negative energy of anxiety in our bodies. So one of the things that's really amazing to do is just tune into your body throughout the day, right? Anxiety is physical, so we feel it. We feel it sometimes in our neck. We feel it in our jaw. Yes. We feel it in our heart. We feel it in our stomach. A lot of people mention that they feel a tingling. And so when you can start literally sort of paying attention to how your body feels and then thinking, am I anxious about something? I tell the story in the book where every Thursday for years, I had migraines and nausea and tremendous anxiety. And I never connected it to the fact that I had a standing Thursday meeting that made me feel sick to my stomach. Well, that's a clue.
I remember one of those.
Right? It's a clue. Yeah. Your body's trying to, someone's telling you something, so you need to tune in.
You talked about the physical consequences there, or the impact. What about the mental? You talk about sort of thought traps. What are the biggest ones you'd call out?
Yeah. Anxiety is physical, it's cognitive, it is a real whole body reaction. And when we're anxious, we sometimes get stuck in behaviors or in thoughts. And I think a lot of us have our favorite anxious behaviors. For me, it's definitely drinking. When I'm anxious, I drink because it instantly relaxes me. Some people go for a run, some people eat candy, some people spend money, you name it. But we have thoughts that happen when we're anxious. And a lot of us get stuck in thought traps, or you might have heard them referred to as sort of automatic negative thoughts, cognitive distortions. And we all have our greatest hits. And so a lot of us, when we're anxious, our brain instantly goes to a place. And maybe it goes to a place of catastrophizing. This is it. I'm done. I'm getting fired, and then I'm going to lose my house, and then I'm going to eat cat food. Or maybe we are bowled over with imposter feelings. I'm a fraud. I don't belong. I'm about to be found out that I don't belong. Maybe we see things just in totally black and white terms. Maybe we just only see things through the lens of our own emotions. If we feel bad, then things are bad. Maybe we're stuck in comparing ourselves. Like our brain goes instantly into these anxious patterns. And the thing is, those are habits. And so in the book, we spend a lot of time talking about how to understand those and then break them.
A lot of that is about, I guess, listening to and changing your inner voice. There's a lot of chat.
So much chat.
It's either whirring away and you actually doing it, or it's there. But it's an inward focus. And you talk again in your book and your work around how do you, if you like, move outwards from that. What have you seen either yourself or for others that, if you like, can propel you from, I'll call it shrinking a little bit and getting into those spirals, the catastrophic spirals, into something more productive? What works?
I mean, there's a saying in therapy land that if you're anxious, do anything. do something. And that's a little bit true, If you're anxious, either in your body where it's hard to breathe properly, or you're jumpy, or in your mind where you're stuck in that. I think everybody can relate to the feeling of waking up in the middle of the night and your brain feels like it's a runaway freight train. Not even a freight train, because those are slow. It's a runaway high-speed train, and you just can't stop it, right? Or you have a thought that's in a loop and you're desperately trying to get out of the loop, but you can't, right? That's rumination. And so the idea is literally to interrupt it and hopefully redirect. And so sometimes you can splash cold water on your face. You can jump up and down. You can turn on music and sing. It sounds really silly, but if you have a thought loop, I'm a failure, I'm lazy, I'm going to get punished, you can sing it. I'm a failure, I'm a failure, I'm a failure, to whatever. And literally, that's telling your brain, let's redirect. And it's externalizing the anxiety. And so part of it is just doing something and experimenting with what works for you.
It's fascinating. You have a lovely voice, by the way, if I may say so.
So do you.
We'll come back to that later. That's another talent. But I was really struck by something you said earlier, where you said, you were literally in bed, you struggled to get out of bed at times, and you obviously referred to different episodes in your life. And yet, and that's the whole point of your work and book, you're super successful in so many different ways. I'm not looking to make you blush. I think some people who either haven't experienced anxiety or are not a super achiever or haven't understood the superpower will think, I don't get how you can go from being either depressed or clinically depressed and anxious and so forth into doing a brilliant podcast or writing an article or giving a speech and so on. When you've been in your darkest moments, if you don't mind me asking, how have you come out of it? Apart from, you talked about jolting yourself and interrupting it, but beyond that, what else has helped you?
When you're in your darkest moments, those tricks don't work. Those aren't for your darkest moments. I mean, part of the work that I want to do is I want to shine a light on people who manage mental illness and show up every day. I think that it's so interesting. I have bipolar disorder, and which manifests itself as a lot of anxiety, hypomania, and then several periods of my life of intense clinical depression. I was talking to another bipolar traveler last week, and he said, we always hear about the statistics, and the statistics around people with bipolar disorder can be very scary, right? Higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of violence, all that stuff. And then we hear about the success stories, right? So entrepreneurs who have bipolar disorder, but, used the mania and sold their company for $1 gazillion. He said, but, we don't ever hear about the stories who just show up every day, do their jobs. And that's really part of what I want to shed a light on, is that there are so many of us living with mental illness who have experienced very, very dark times. And there are so many of us who don't have mental illness who have experienced very, very dark times because life is hard. And this is going to sound really woo-woo, but when we do the work, we usually come through. And I have medication, and I have therapy, and I have my whole infrastructure that mostly keeps me really healthy. And most people don't like to talk about it because it's scary and it makes you feel weak and it's vulnerable. But I am so grateful for people who do talk about it.
It takes a lot of courage. And I again take my hat off to you, because I know people in corporate environments where talking about any form of mental health issues to significant illness would be, and not only in their mind, but would be generally considered you're weak, you're not good at your job anymore.
I'm not in corporate.
And it's like it's like you have a stain on you. Whereas if you broke your leg and then you recovered, people wouldn't think twice about it. Whereas if you had an episode, people don't do it. What a beautiful cat. For listeners, that's lovely. What a lovely moment. So I guess there's something around how you pick the right environment that works for you, and you're yourself. You have your own own business.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think I just want to highlight what you've hit on, which is that it's very difficult when you work in an organization, whether that is a corporation or even, a nonprofit organization, government, to be public about this stuff because the stigma is so strong. I am very privileged to not give it, what, but if I were an officer in a publicly traded company, it would be a totally different story. And that's really the challenge that we all face.
Yeah. If you're somebody working with or being with somebody who has explicitly some form of mental health condition in the way you've eloquently described it, and of course every individual has unique characteristics and situations, but what's your advice for a person who's there around somebody with a condition?
I think it depends if the person is in crisis or if they're fine. If they're in crisis, they're in crisis and they need to have immediate attention. And that does happen with managers have people in crisis on their teams all the time for various reasons. And that's why companies have HR and benefits and all that stuff. But, I think a lot of people like myself, we're just wired a little bit more tricky. This goes for,
beautiful way to put it.
This goes for people who are neurodivergent as well. Maybe people who have autism or who have ADHD, right? Who are just like wired differently and need to learn and work differently. And I wish we lived in a world where it could be like, I really can't read because I have ADHD or I have dyslexia and it's really not my favorite way to learn. I learn by listening. And so really, instead of sending me this long email, is there a way that you could record a voice memo?
Gosh, I should have done that.
Do you have dyslexia or ADHD?
No, but if you, I don't know if you're referring to yourself or more generally. You're talking about more generally.
Well, I can't. I don't read well. I listen.
Yeah, I'm saying if I known that, I realize now looking at my email to you, it was far too long. So for future reference, I'll know that. Oh no,
it's all good. It's all good. But I wish we lived in that world because everybody then would work so much better and be so amazing. I've interviewed so many people on my podcast who have tricky brains, and they are extremely gifted and yet extremely challenged. And that's great.
It's funny, isn't it? Because funny, in inverted commas, that's a sort of British meaning. It's not funny at all, but sort of interesting. Whether it's a mental health condition or a disability, and they are distinct, which most people don't understand, there seems to be they're in different spaces compared to other forms of difference, whether that's down by style or experience. If you said, for example, I prefer, for whatever reason, I prefer to listen to things and so forth, as opposed to read them, and you're in a reasonably supportive environment, I think most people would just, absolutely fine. If, however, you explained the reason for it and you just did, I think a lot of people would think, oh gosh, I'm having to make an inverted commas, an adjustment, which is an HR term.
We would say accommodation.
Accommodation, or an adjustment. I mean, that's a long way to go. But let's flip it for a moment because, your book is very uplifting.
Yeah.
Yes, it talks about the anxiety, the causes, the symptoms and the impacts. But this is around how do you turn it into, and you've alluded to a real superpower. And just cutting to the chase, if you think about successful leaders in whatever shape or form they come, do they all have to have an element of anxiety to them?
Yes. I've never met, that doesn't mean you have a clinical anxiety disorder. There's a distinction, but leadership is full of anxiety. Leadership is about scanning the environment for threats. It's about thinking ahead. It's about planning. It's about being ready to go. It's about being able to summon motivation and energy when you don't feel it. And so, of course, leadership is about anxiety, and anxiety is an ancient emotion in our toolkit of emotions for a reason. And so I think the more that leaders say the word in a totally normal setting, the more comfortable we all become with it. I think
that's a great point,
right? Like what person who's about to IPO isn't anxious? What person who's about to testify, or litigate in court isn't anxious? Totally normal. Of course you are. And so, I think a lot of it is about language.
And it's how you introduce it, because I know one CEO for the first time talked about his imposter syndrome, and he's close to being an alpha male, confident, very accomplished leader. I mean, a great person. And if you said, he has some anxiety, most people who know him will come across that you've got to be kidding. And he dropped it into a conversation with a group and talked about his imposter syndrome, not just at the beginning of the role, but in a number of situations. And for me, it wasn't just doing it. It was the skill of it. It was part of a dialogue, as opposed to, I'm here now, I've got this big moment, I'm going to tell you all about my imposter syndrome, like that over disclosure.
Totally.
But the ripple effect, the multiplier effect across the organization, he didn't quite clock it at the time, of opening up people to say, yeah, I feel a bit that way. What can we do about it? Amazing. Amazing. No.
Everybody feels imposter. If you don't feel imposter syndrome, there's something wrong with you, right? And so the more successful you get, the better rooms you're in, the more you feel imposter syndrome. Now, that doesn't mean that you're someone like me who instantly feels imposter syndrome in every room you're in, but it's normal. You know, I just interviewed wonderful Russell Glass from Headspace, who sold a company to LinkedIn, and he talked all about his imposter syndrome when he sold his former startup to LinkedIn. And he had gone from a company that he started and knew intimately and was smaller to being an executive at this huge company. He felt imposter syndrome. And you're like, to your point, you're like, of course you did. So I love that. I don't think that everything needs to be a TED Talk. And I do worry that in our culture, you know, we love the story. That's kind of my job. But, you know, normalizing this stuff is about sprinkling in language. I'm sorry, my if you hear purring, listeners, that's my kitten.
That's the first on the podcast.
Is it really?
That was an additional embellishment, which is wonderful. If you're somebody listening to this, Morra, who has some form of anxiety, so I got it manageable, so not in crisis, but it's a part of their life. They're successful enough, but they're thinking, how do I channel it more effectively? What would be the immediate things that come to mind? I'm keen in this conversation, as you've already been doing, of giving people some stimulus and some real actions that they can take away.
You know, here's the thing. If this is you, I want you to think about having a relationship with your anxiety, not getting rid of it, not ignoring it, not working through it, having a relationship with you. It's a piece of you. And it's probably a really useful piece of you that has helped get you where you are. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a pain in the butt. And so the key is to really see it and externalize it and understand it, because then you can really manage it, right? So you might be someone, for example, who gets very, very anxious before a meeting in which you have to speak. Very common, right?
Yeah.
And so this may be difficult in your life. You might wish, God, this is a waste of anxiety. So, okay, great. You know that about yourself. Can you get coaching? Can you get help? Can you build skills around it? Just as you would, as I had to, because I was terrible at Excel and I was a media manager in my early career and I had to learn how to do Excel. So there are skills. So the key is not to pretend like it doesn't exist or just take a beta blocker or feel ashamed of it. It's to really try to understand it.
Yeah, that's great.
And build skills. And my book is full of those skills. But the truth is that your anxiety might be part of who you are.
That's brilliant. Looking back on your life, what was the biggest breakthrough that helped you realize that anxiety was one of your superpowers?
I mean, for me, it was a real moment in my life when I gave a speech at my alma mater, Brown University in the U.S., and I spoke about my depression and my anxiety, and I got a standing ovation. This was many, many years ago. This was 11 years ago before, and I realized that by externalizing it and really actually writing a speech about it, I could look at it critically. And, I'm a big believer in self-awareness. I talk a lot in the book about leaders who have, often through hardship, become self-aware. Nobody likes leaders, or anybody, frankly, who just acts out their SHIT unconsciously. And yet we deal with it. That's toxic workplace. That's everything we deal with when our boss is micromanaging us and making us feel ashamed and controlling. And the easiest way to not do that is to start to tune in and understand the motivations that are driving you. And believe it or not, you can start doing that by just the next time you sit at your desk, taking a second and checking in like maybe scanning through your body, noticing how you're breathing. Am I breathing shallow? Am I breathing okay? What does my day look like? Sometimes what I do is I look at my calendar and I'll look at a meeting that I have and I'll get anxious. Like my body will react and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? That is an incredible clue to something.
As you say, it's really being in tune with yourself. And I love that framing of having a relationship with the anxiety and understanding it, and then really tackling it like a project, if you like. Not project, but really tackling it and thinking, how do I address it? What skills do I need to nurture? And where can I find joy? Because that joy you refer to a number of places. Yeah, and you talk about doing an audit, which that's a word that gives me anxiety for lots of reasons, even though I'm not an accountant by background. But what is your work on your own joy told you about yourself? Where do you find joy?
I have learned the practice of actively cultivating joy, and it has changed my life. The thing about anxiety is that it takes up a lot of brain space, right? That it's crowded in there. It's busy. It's like the tube at rush hour in there. And so when you can literally, I see my anxiety, I see it as a hurricane in the front of my brain, and I close my eyes and like Zeus, I think, pulling Athena. Didn't Athena come from Zeus's brain? One of them did. I pull it out and I put that hurricane onto a piece of paper and I write down what's making me anxious, or I make a plan, or I do a schedule or something. Get that anxiety on paper. And then I think, oh, I have all this space in my brain now. Maybe I could fill it with some joy. Maybe I could fill it with some creativity. Maybe I could fill it with nothing. But I love that visualization. I know this sounds a little bit woo, but I promise you, when your brain is swirling and it's rush hour in there, just that visualization of taking the hurricane or the tornado or whatever it is and externalizing, putting it on paper gives you space. And that's amazing. Yeah.
I think of little boxes when I sort of write things down and put notes in, sometimes actual boxes, sort of written it down, the cathartic part, and then put it, and it's like, and then the keys, I've got the key, I can open it up again, and I open the box and close it, but it's there and away from me for a period of time. A lot of what you described there and previously, Morra, is you're doing your own work. And obviously you refer to therapists, and depending on your country, that's more common than others. It's obviously not common, but it's a regular practice in the US, perhaps less so in some other countries. What's the balance for you in terms of doing your own work as opposed to getting the support from other people, whether it's friends, family, co-workers, therapists? I'm not looking for a percentage, but a lot of what you've talked about has been doing your own work. Is that typical?
I think that, no. I mean, I do my own work because I've been in therapy for decades. I think, and this is an American point of view. In the US, we often equate leadership with being alone and being the one in charge, which means, it's lonely at the top. And I actually think it can't be lonely at the top. And that doesn't mean that you're best friends and whining to all your colleagues. That means that you have a team. I love sports and athletics, and I have interviewed a ton of athletes. And what we know about every single successful athlete is they have a team, right? They have a trainer, they eat right, they have probably a psychologist. And I encourage people who are serious at their jobs to think like an athlete. Who is on my team?
Yes, absolutely.
And that is essential. Part of what makes us even more anxious and depressed is when we're alone. And when we are anxious and depressed, we close other people off. And so part of the work is building in a team so that you have people to turn to and help take care of yourself.
If you were to look into the future and then look back on your life, what impact are you looking to have on the world around you?
Whew, God. I have 3 children. And so I want to be a good mother, and that's a weighty, intense thing to think about. But I really want to be a good mother, but I think that I have a lot of privilege in this world. I was born into this world with a lot of privilege. And so in the back half of my life, I really want to help use that privilege and platform. And I believe that mental health is so important.
Yes. It's funny how you say that, where I should stop using that word. That's lazy.
What word?
Where I realized caring for a disabled child and moving to a more solitary role now than I was when I was in a previous career where I had lots of people. It's the first time really I've had to be conscious of my mental health. I haven't had any particular episodes, but the loneliness of the life, which is partly physical, it's just not being around a lot of people, but it's actually the mental part, which is I don't feel people get me or my situation. Who's around me really empathizes, compassion with being a carer, parent, and yet very, very ambitious, which I am professionally. But to your point earlier, whenever I've felt that way, and I felt it recently as we're at the time of this recording looking to move house, which is reasonably stressful with all the things that all the complications that go. It's the doing something, reaching out to somebody, not necessarily for help, but just a connection can really make you feel differently, because that's that bond, that spark. Even if they're I'm here, that's enough sometimes, as opposed to, I really need to sit down with you for half an hour to get your advice. It's not, you don't need to go that far sometimes. So my point is, I've now learned more about mental health, partly because the people I've worked with and for have had challenges and conditions, but actually myself. And I take your point about privilege as well.
We all have mental health, right? Because we have brains. So we all have mental health. And
yes, indeed.
and it's, in this day and age, for me to say, ignore your physical health, eat chocolate and fried chicken every day and don't exercise, you'd be like, no. And so it's the same thing. And I just about your point about loneliness, there's a loneliness epidemic in the United States, certainly. I'm sure it's not different in Britain.
Absolutely.
We are relational creatures, but when we are going through special circumstances, we need people who understand those circumstances. And I think that for men also, it's really hard. And if I could also do anything with my life, it would be to help people understand that it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question. You've alluded to a few things that are in relation to this. When you're having your absolutely best day, let's end on a positive. When you're having your best day, what's the one or two things or people that really help you to do your best, brilliant work, where you're knocking it out of the park?
The people who I get to collaborate with. I mean, it's the biggest privilege in my life. The kind of people that I work with every single day, the team that I have worked with for years and years and years. And, the people you surround yourself with are who you are and what you want to be. So that's another thing. If you're feeling in your life like no one gets me, I'm showing up in this place every day and nobody gets me, well, then maybe it's not the place for you.
Absolutely. Wow. What an empowering message. We have choices. We have more choices. We have more options than we often think, however difficult our circumstances. Your book is, I believe, a seminal work. And I'm not here as your agent, but it's
oh God,
it's a seminal work. It's not only the topic you pick, but it's substantive, it's real, it's personal, and it leaves people with a real, if you like, action platform to make those choices from. This conversation has really moved me in terms of you sharing your wisdom, framing a topic that's been misunderstood or just shoved under the carpet as one for far, far too long. And you're shining a light on it. And many, many people will be better, not only through this conversation, but all the work and conversations that you are having and doing. So I applaud you for that sincerely, Morra. And I'm very grateful for you coming on this show.
You're making me.
Thank you. Well, on that note, let's uplifting, because this is about turning into superpower. So I hope I've left everyone not only feeling moved, but also feeling there's possibility and there's brighter futures ahead of us. And that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I hope you enjoyed this episode and took a lot from it as much as I did. Do check out the other episodes in the series. Give me a nice rating if you're being really generous, and do subscribe to the platforms.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.